Let's break the political talk show mold. Anything worth doing is hard, and that includes being a good citizen. Our mission is to help you be that better citizen by letting you hear about stuff you might not know, which will make everyone think you're so smart, or by giving you a chance to listen to interviews and debates on a wide variety of subjects that might actually allow you to form new opinions in the privacy of your own mind. I'm Justin Oldham, and you are listening to the Politics and Patriotism Show here on the Stitcher Smart Radio Network. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to another historical edition of the Politics and Patriotism Show. Now, it's been said that truth is stranger than fiction, and so in this 41-minute episode, I'm going to prove that to you by giving you a chance to hear from author and historian Joseph Wheelan, who's going to tell us about his book, Jefferson's War, that was written in 2004, and it talks about America's first encounter with Muslim extremists in North Africa. It will come as a surprise to many of my fellow Americans that the events of September 11th, 2001 are in fact not entirely unique in our history. That was not the first time we have come to blows with Muslim extremists. Once upon a time, as the 19th century dawned, American President Thomas Jefferson, the very same guy who helped craft the United States Constitution, was called to duty. He had to deal with the Barbary Pirates in North Africa. These guys were Muslim extremists in their own right who were using passages from the Quran as justifications for looting and pillaging and ransoming and doing all kinds of that swashbuckler stuff that is generally not good for public relations. Now, as Mr. Wheelan will point out, there are historical differences between then and now. But even so, the thought is still the same. There are bad guys in some distant part of the world who mean to do us harm, and we had to do something about it. So settle in and get ready for a history lesson that ought to be a little bit entertaining as well. This is Jefferson's War by Joseph Wheelan. It was published by Public Affairs Press in 2004. You can find it on Amazon. It's available in Kindle, and if you like what you hear in this presentation today, go out and find it.
I'm Joe Wheelan. I wrote this book in 2002, 2003. It's called Jefferson's War, America's First War on Terror. And it's about the America's first Barbary War in 1801 through 1805. And I was inspired to write it after 9/11. I thought I saw parallels between what had happened to the United States back in the late 1790s and early 1800s and what was going on in the Middle East and the attacks on the United States, with the theme of Islam behind both of them. And so I started to do research on this. I found out that this war actually was the United States' first contact with Islam. Before that, we had traded in the Mediterranean. We had never gone to Constantinople or any of those places. We traded along the southern shores of Europe under the protection of Great Britain. This was until the Revolutionary War. And Britain dealt with the Barbary state. And as you know, the Barbary state, there are 4 of them. They're still around. Tripoli, Tunis, called Algiers back then, and Morocco. And they were 4 Barbary states. And Britain and all the European powers paid tribute to them every year so that they could trade in the Mediterranean. And whenever they fell behind on their payments or those states wanted more money, they would break the treaty, and they would attack commercial shipping in the Mediterranean. And so then the European powers would have to make a new treaty, of course, paying more money, more tribute. And this had gone on actually since the 1600s. And back in the 1600s, early 1700s, those nations in North Africa were actually quite powerful naval countries, and they were able to enforce their idea of how European states should would pay tribute, and so they amassed huge riches. Algiers, the capital of Algiers, was one of the largest cities in that part of the world. 100,000 people in the 1600s. One of the most opulent cities, just from all this loot they were getting from ships. They would capture the passengers, the crew, and sell them as slaves in the slave market. They went raiding. Once they got sailing ships, they went outside outside of Gibraltar into the Atlantic, and they raided just kind of unbelievable coast of England, Ireland, Iceland, Denmark. Spain and Italy took the brunt of it, though, and they reportedly lost over a period of time, each of them, 300 to 500,000 people due to these raids. It was serious stuff. There were, hundreds of, they called them corsairs, Barbary corsairs, these long-bowed ships, the lateen sails, and they would cruise up, usually under a flag of another country, Britain or France or someone, cruise up to some unsuspecting commercial ship and then bring the surprise on them that they were not from that nation, that they were pirates. And so they would demand that they surrender. If they did not, they had men up in the mast, muskets. They had boarding crew ready to go. They had people with cannons ready to blow them up. So they were pretty feared in the Mediterranean. The appellation, the terror, was applied to them because that's how they were viewed back then, the terror. Because of what they did. And they believed that Islam empowered them to do this in God's name, to attack the Christians, to attack the non-believers, and to take their possessions and their women and children and enslave them and sell them or turn them into slaves. So that was the situation. By the late 1700s, the Barbary states weren't as powerful as they were. They were languishing. Their power had faded. But the European states were still paying them tribute. Every now and then, they would go too far, and Britain or the Dutch or the French, they would send a fleet over there and just blow hell out of one of their port cities and then sail away. And it really didn't have any lasting impact when they did that. The United States, as I was saying, until the Revolutionary War, they traded in the Mediterranean, meaning Italy, southern France, those play Portugal around the bend, around Gibraltar, without much of a problem, really. Great Britain took care of them. We had about 100 ships a year that went into the Mediterranean trading. But then the war came along, and we declared our independence. A treaty was made, and we were free of England, and we had no protection, and we had no money. So this was kind of a dilemma that we found ourselves in the 1780s.
Okay, I understand. It's one thing to be afraid of the big, bad, nasty, scary pirates, but I'm somewhat familiar with the period in question, and there really was a lack of political will to deal with the problem because it was just easier to hand over the money.
Well, that was one part of it, yes. But the other part was that by paying the money, they could trade in the Mediterranean. And the nations in Europe that could not afford to pay could not trade in the Mediterranean. It became a monopoly of trading nations, meaning basically England, Denmark, and the Dutch. And the French, and that was it. And eventually Denmark was priced out of the market. So they were able to dominate the trade. It's kind of a pay-to-play type of deal. I think that's how they viewed it. I mean, it's very cynical, but they paid the tribute to keep the Barbary pirates off their backs and to put them on the backs of anyone else who had not paid or could not afford to pay.
So then, of course, we are able to get in there thanks to the Treaty of Amity and Commerce through the French. That was circa 1778, as I recall. And as you mentioned, eventually that runs out because the war runs its course, and yay, we've got our independence. And along comes Mr. Jefferson, and he finally decides to do something about that. Now, anybody who has studied Jefferson knows that he's had a lot to say about the Barbary Pirates long before he becomes president.
Yes, this is true. He When he was ambassador or minister to Paris after the war, say around 1784, 1785, his good friend at that time was John Adams, who was the minister in England. And one day Adams was out walking at night, and he noticed this handsome residence, and on the door was a nameplate, and it said it was the embassy for Tripoli. And he thought, aha, he wanted to find out possibly how much they would demand, and if the United States could get back into the Mediterranean. And so he went in and he left his card there. He did not speak to the ambassador. And he sent a letter to Jefferson in Paris, and he said, come on over. Let's go see this man. His name was Abderrahman. And so they went over there to his home one evening. They got an invitation, and they sat down with him before his fire, and friendly man and everything, and they said, well, how much would it cost for the United States to be able to get back into the Mediterranean and trade? And he said, well, for 1 year, it would be $60,000. For perpetuity, it would be $160,000. And he said, and that's just for our country. Algiers surely would demand more, because Algiers is the great power among those four nations. And then you'd have to pay Tunis and Morocco, too. And they toted it all up, and perpetual peace, they figured it would cost about $1 million altogether. And so they left, and they were kind of crestfallen by this development. And what do we do? What should the United States do? The United States had no money. We were totally broke. Treasury was empty. We were in debt. We had no navy, but they decided to have an exchange of views. So they wrote each other letters and stated their opinions on this. It was kind of interesting. Adams thought the best thing to do would be to pay. I mean, if they had the money, to pay, and they would be cheaper. They'd be able to start trading right away. They would recoup whatever they paid. They wouldn't have to build a navy. Jefferson said it would be better to repel force with force. This would be a good occasion for a navy. And he listed the reasons for that. Basically said that we would gain stature in the eyes of Europe. We would be able to trade in the Mediterranean. We would earn the respect of those four Barbary states. And we would have a navy, which we could use for other things. And he said this would be the best thing to do. But, of course, the only tax at that time, this was during the Articles of Confederation, was the postage stamp. And you're not going to build a navy with postage stamp revenue. So this went by the wayside. But it was a very interesting discussion. Jefferson, who was viewed by a lot of people as kind of a pacifist because of the attitude he took when he was president during his second term with Great Britain and with the embargo and all that business, rather than going to war with Great Britain, he imposed this trade embargo. And so a lot of people interpret that as meaning that he was unwilling to engage, but actually not at all. He just did not have the opportunity until he became president in 1801.
Right. Now, this is in the early portion of the country where we're still forming doctrines and policies and feeling our way along, and other countries know things that we don't. And so as we're figuring this out, I think it was very prescient of Jefferson to understand that you do actually have to pick and choose your battles. And what's fascinating to me about the Barbary pirate situation in the context of the modern happenings in Africa is that the policies that the government put forward then and acted upon versus what the government is putting forward and acting upon today almost seem to be mirror opposites, in my opinion. One group of leaders from an era is choosing to be nationalistic and proactive, and another group of leaders is choosing to be multilateral and more pacifistic and more interested in the use of soft power. And that in and of itself is fascinating to me because it does bear up the old adage that those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it.
Well, that's an interesting point. However, I would point out that in Jefferson's time, they were dealing with nation states, and it was the policy of those states to attack our shipping. Whereas today, it's an amorphous thing that we are up against. We're against organizations that cross several countries. They stretch all the way across North Africa. They're more than one organization. They're extremist groups. They're Al-Qaeda. They're any number of things. The countries where they are based are not happy host nations. They're in remote areas of those countries for the most part. It's very difficult to react toward that the same way that Jefferson did.
I'd like to stop for a quick commercial break, and when we come back on the other side of this, I'd like you to pick up your narrative and tell us about Jefferson's War, because it's not just a good story. I think this is really worth hearing about.
I'm Luke Herbert, and this program is supported by SafeRadio.com.
First of all, during the late 1790s, we paid the tribute. When John Adams was president, we paid tribute. We paid about $1 million worth of tribute to the four Barbary states, starting under the Washington administration and through Adams. As you know, Jefferson was Adams's vice president, but he had as little to do with being vice president as he possibly could. And he often was not in Philadelphia at all. He was at Monticello working on his house and farming and doing various things. So the policy that we followed during that time was Adams's policy. We pay, and by coincidence, we also built a navy. The first U.S. frigate navy, the first 6 frigate ships, and then we expanded from there. As we got into this war with France, which we call the Quasi-War, it was entirely a naval war. It fought in the Caribbean from 1798 to 1800, and then Adams made peace with France. So a lot of the naval officers that were in charge at the time that Jefferson became president had fought in the Quasi-War, and they had some experience. But Jefferson was sworn in March 4th, 1801, after a bruising political campaign. He and Adams just went at it hammer and tongs, character assassination, smears, the whole bit. And then, at the end of it all, when the vote was cast, the electoral vote was a tie between Jefferson and his running mate, Aaron Burr, and it went to the House of Representatives and was not decided until the 36th ballot. So it was just an exhausting process. So everyone was kind of relieved. Jefferson is sworn in. He gave a speech that no one could hear because he had such a soft voice. And within 2 weeks, he had issued an order to the Navy to fit out a squadron to sail to the Mediterranean. Squadron of Observation, he called it. He didn't consult with Congress. There was no press release. There was nothing. He just did it. He talked to some of his cabinet members, and that was it. Not even the full cabinet. But several months earlier, it was in October, I believe, of 1800, Tripoli had captured a U.S. Commercial ship in the Mediterranean and taken everybody prisoner. It was called the Catherine. And they weren't supposed to do this. We had a treaty with them. We had been paying them. I think we had paid them $56,000 a year or something like that. And but they sent word that they wanted a renewal of the treaty in 6 months, or they would declare war in the United States. So Jefferson knew this when he took office, and he decided he wasn't going to negotiate. He was going to send a fleet out there. So they were outfitted, and in June they set out for the Mediterranean. There were just 4 ships under Commodore Richard Dale, a very small operation. Before he even sailed, we didn't know this, but the Bashaw of Tripoli had ordered his soldiers to chop down the flagpole at the U.S. Embassy, which was the way they declared war. So we were at war when we arrived.
What can you tell us about the captains, the crew, the officer corps that sailed as part of this task force?
The officers, some of them had combat experience, most of them did not. There was no naval academy. There was no formal training of naval crews. They were seamen. Many of them had been seamen on merchant ships and then had come into the Navy. It wasn't as though the Navy was then thought of as a prestigious place to be. There had been no Navy for a long time after the Continental Navy during the Revolutionary War went out of service, and we had no ships at all. And so they formed the new U.S. Navy in 1798 to fight the quasi-war with France. And that's when the new Marine Corps was founded, too, which would have a role in the Barbary War. So they were new people for the most part. There were a few veterans. Edward Preble, who was led the third squadron out there, knew what he was about. John Rogers was another one, followed with the fourth. They had experience, but most of them not so much. But they had good young officers. There's one ship that went with Dale on the first squadron. It was USS Enterprise, and it had 12 guns, commanded by Andrew Sterrett. They got to the Mediterranean, and Dale went cruising off of Tripoli, sent Sterrett to get supplies. So he sailed off, and he was attacked by a Tripolitan ship, 14-gun ship, called the Tripoli. And all the way across the Atlantic, Sterrett, he was a tough guy. He drilled his crew in gunnery all the way over. Now the Barbary captains and their crews, they weren't very good gunners. They didn't have to be. They were bullies. They bullied merchant ships, which would have maybe 6 guns or 4 or something and a small crew. They won by intimidation and overpowering numbers. They had these big crews that would boarding parties that would pour onto the decks. But anyway, here they met the first U.S. ship that they had. This was the first meeting between an Islamic Navy ship and a United States Navy ship in combat. And Sterrett's crew, over a period of a couple of hours, never let them get close, and with their guns and with the Marines in the rigging, just slaughtered the Tripolitans. They shredded the ship. The masts were toppled. There were 30 dead men on the deck. So finally, they tried to feign surrender. They'd show the white flag, and then we would stop firing, and then they would start firing. But finally, that wore thin. We sent a boat over there with a doctor and doctored up the ones that were alive and helped them rig up some tiny mast and sent it off. This was a good message to the Bashaw about meeting the naval ships. That was the last time that they ever sent any ships out against the U.S. Navy ships. They stayed close to harbor after that.
Tell us about Stephan Decatur.
Yes, young Stephan Decatur. He was a lieutenant. He was in the 3rd Squadron, and actually the 3rd Squadron was the first squadron that did anything. Had a really good Commodore, Captain Edward Preble, and he was a good, tough leader. And he was determined to attack the Tripoli's harbor. But unfortunately, the first thing that happened was this frigate, the USS Philadelphia, was in the harbor, didn't have good maps, and ran aground. They could not get off the reef. And so they surrendered to the Tripolitans. They were taken prisoner, a crew of 300. So now Tripoli had 300 American hostages in their dungeons, and they demanded a hefty ransom, which we refused to pay. So they had the ship, which the ship was not destroyed or anything. Actually, when it floated off the reef a couple days later, and they took it over, he was going to give it to Tunis in payment of debt or something. Stephan Decatur volunteered with a crew of a bunch of other men for a nighttime commando operation to burn the Philadelphia. And so they did. They took a merchant vessel of Tripolis. They captured one, and they disguised themselves, and they sailed in at night to the Philadelphia, and they were going to destroy it. So they sailed in right under the guns of the city, boarded the ship, Decatur leading them, killed the crew, that about 20 Tripolitans that were in charge of the ship, and burned it to the waterline and escaped with one man wounded. And it was just a brilliant feat, and Decatur was hailed throughout Europe. Admiral Nelson called it the most brilliant feat of the age, and it was just a stroke. And it threw some terror into the Bashaw, Karamanli, who was the ruler at Tripoli. Of course, they took it out on the prisoners and flogged them and beat them in the streets and everything. But it was a good first move.
I'd like to take a quick commercial break, and when we come back on the other side, please do continue your story.
This program is brought to you by ShadowFusionBooks.com.
Edward Preble and the U.S. fleet, they attacked Tripoli a couple of times, and they had a pitched battle in the harbor with Tripoli's navy and gunboats and everything, and they sank a bunch of the ships, took a bunch of prisoners, killed scores and scores of people, but they could never really crack the harbor. They had no landing parties. They had no plan for going ashore. And there was a consul in Tunis, next country over, who was watching all this, and his name was William Eaton. And he thought we were going about it all wrong. He thought the way we were going to win this war is by having soldiers on the ground and not just purely through naval action. And this was his belief, and he got into a huge argument with the leader of Tunis. He was the consul to Tunis, and he was not a good choice because he really despised the way the leaders of those countries acted toward the Europeans, just their condescending attitude, and they were so insulting. Eaton had an army background. He had fought with Mad Anthony Wayne in the Indian Wars in the early 1790s against the Miami Indians in Indiana, Battle of Falling Timbers, and Mad Anthony Wayne was his hero. And Wayne really admired Eaton. Eaton turned out to be just a spectacular soldier. He used him as a spy. He could infiltrate Indian camps. He learned the languages of the Indians. He was a master of disguise. He could ride a horse better than anybody. He was an expert pistol shot, expert musket shot. He could use throwing knives. He was like an archetypical commando of that period. And anyway, one of his hobbies was learning Arabic. He learned 4 Arab languages on his own. He read the Quran numerous times. And in the 1790s, when John Adams took office, he got Adams to send him over to Tunis as a consul. But that was falling apart, and he was sent away. And so he came back to America, and he went to Jefferson, and he told Jefferson what he thought, what he had seen and what he thought, which was naval power alone was not going to do it. Give me some money and some rifles, and I will go over there, and we will attack Tripoli by land. He had no army, but there was the brother of the Bashaw of Tripoli. His name was Hammett, was in exile, and he was actually the lawful ruler of Tripoli, but he was driven out by his younger brother. So he was in exile in Egypt. And so Eaton went back, and he had $20,000. He had a title. He was special naval agent, which, for whatever that was worth. And he had weapons. And at his disposal were 3 small ships, naval ships. So they took him to Egypt, and he raised an army with Hammett of European mercenaries, disaffected Tripolitan people, Arab horsemen, and started spreading around the money. And then he led a march, 520-mile march across the what is now called the Libyan Desert in 1805, and launched an attack on Tripoli's number 2 city, which was Derna.
Now, in terms of the outcome of that battle, what was the European reaction to that?
The Europeans' reaction, I think they were thrilled. I mean, they didn't like dealing with any of the Barbary states, but the main thing was it threw a big scare into the Bashaw. So here came this army, and they started out with 400 men, and it was quite a journey, and there were rebellions by the Arabs and everything else. And there was 8 U.S. Marines, and there was a naval ensign, and there was Eaton. And those were the 10 Americans in that force. Everyone else was from somewhere else. But along the way, they picked up all these other disaffected people. And by the time they reached Derna, they had 1,000 people. So the Bashaw was frightened. And he rushed an army over there. But they didn't get there soon enough. Eaton attacked the city as 3 naval ships stood off and battered the shore and the city with naval gunfire. And they captured the city. And the Marines raised the Stars and Stripes over Derna. It was the first time Stars and Stripes had been raised after a hostile action over a foreign territory in our history.
Tell you what, that's better than Hollywood.
Isn't it?
Continue the story. How does this thing end?
William Eaton, remarkable man. He had meetings, and he sent a letter and everything to the Commodore at that time, and he wanted to launch an attack now on the city of Tripoli with his army. And he said, we can go in there, we can defeat their army, we can free the captives, and we can make the Bashaw our prisoner. So that's all we need to do. However, at the same time, there were other things going on. Jefferson had gotten impatient, and he was being badgered a little bit by Congress and his cabinet. Let's end this thing. It was costing them money, which we didn't have a lot of then. So he authorized this diplomat, Tobias Lear, to open peace talks with the Bashaw. And Eaton didn't know about this at the time. And anyway, Tobias Lear met with the Bashaw's people, and they were very eager to reach an agreement at this point. They could just see Hammett and Eaton and those troops coming into Tripoli. They were really scared. So we paid them $60,000 to free the 300 members of the Philadelphia crew, and $6,000 tribute. And we said, there's no more tribute, and that's it. And that was the treaty. So we stopped paying tribute to Tripoli, and the fleet sailed away with the prisoners, with the Philadelphia prisoners. There were 5 of them that actually they called it turning Turk. They turned Turk, which means that they converted to Islam because they got better treatment. So everybody left except them, and then they were marched out of the city of Tripoli, the city gates, into the desert, and they were never seen again.
Ouch. Now, speaking of being seen again, of the Americans who participate in these things, tell us about the people who went on to have notable careers after this.
Well, the Preble's force especially was called, they were called Preble's boys. They were the lieutenants who fought during those battles in the harbor of Tripoli. Stephan Decatur is probably the best known of them, but there were others. There was Isaac Chauncey. I can't think of all their names, but there were probably half a dozen of them that went on during the War of 1812 to command large ships against the British. Stephan Decatur had a brilliant career. Fought 2 pitched battles that he won, one in the Atlantic and one in the Pacific, against the British Royal Navy, which was the best in the world. Stood up to them. We didn't we didn't beat them down or anything. But he acquired quite a name for himself, promoted to captain. He died in a duel in 1820 outside of Washington with another naval officer who had commanded the ship, the USS Chesapeake, in 1807. And it was the ship that was captured by the British right out of Chesapeake Bay. And he had surrendered, and they had a court of inquiry, and Decatur was on it, and he was stripped he was suspended for some time. And then when he tried to return to command, Decatur blocked him. So there was bad blood there, and they had a duel, and he killed Decatur.
It was certainly an eventful period, a transformative period, and a period in which a lot of lessons were learned, to be sure. So now this book was published in 2004 through Public Affairs. It's still on Amazon. It's also available in a Kindle edition, so I certainly want to encourage people to go ahead and get this and read it, because it's just as relevant now as it was at the time it was published. And so I'm just curious to know, okay, I mentioned the recent events in Africa, so I would like to tie up here. Now, we've had this discussion about the Barbary states, and we look at Africa now and what's happening there. How will the U.S. foreign policy that evolved from the Barbary pirate activities play out? Do you think any of our past decisions will work as a form of wisdom to help us get through current crises?
Certainly. Certainly. Well, in that war, actually, we used a lot of the things that we learned in that war when we first went into Afghanistan in 2001 and 2002. We went in there with special operations troops, and and formed a temporary alliance with the Northern Alliance against the Taliban and drove them out. This was just exactly what the United States did in Barbary back, 200 years earlier. Formed temporary alliances with the Kingdom of Italy. They gave us gunboats. Sicily, English let us use their bases. We used remote bases in former Soviet Union, southern states of the former Soviet Union. We used and we worked with native troops, as William Eaton did. We worked with the Northern Alliance, so we did learn that tactically. As far as foreign policy, I think Jefferson laid down kind of the markers for our foreign policy for a long time, which was to act with force when our national interests were at stake, and that for a very long time had been the guiding principle, I think, of this country. Today, it is completely complicated by what we're facing in the war on terror. These are forces that have allegiance to no state. They operate from state to state. It's very difficult, and it's confusing, and our foreign policy is confused, too. There's a cry to jump into all these civil wars that are going on in all of these countries. But I think what we need to do is step back and ask ourselves, is our national interest, what national interest that we have is at stake? Be it Egypt or Syria or wherever it is, Algeria, Northern Africa, what is it? And should we, there's this opposition, well, not more than 20 years ago, to becoming what everybody feared, that we'd become the world's policeman. And it just seems like we're being drawn into that role more and more. And I think we really need to look at it and lay down some policy markers about, which ones are going to go into and which we're not. And not necessarily case by case, but a policy.
So there you have it, a little history and a little food for thought. Check, 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 1, 2, 3, check. A little more proof that the more things change, the more they remain the same. And unfortunately, further proof that we've come to the end of a very fast 45 minutes. So, if you like what you heard here today, you can find us online at politicsandpatriotism.com. And if you enjoyed authored interviews like this, you can subscribe to our RSS feed and hear lots more. You can also go to the iTunes store and download all of our past episodes for free. Or if you happen to be one of those mobile type who's always on the go, you can stop by Stitcher.com, and thanks to the nice people at the Stitcher Smart Radio Network, you can download the free app, which will allow you to take us with you anywhere you go in your iPhone, your Android device, your tablet, or your laptop computer, and it's accessible anywhere you can plug into that there internet thing on this planet Earth. So on behalf of everyone here at the show, thank you for your time and have a good day.